What's good, everybody? I'm Jędrek. He's Sodek. Oh, wait, that's not right. It's just me today, and I'm here to talk about why I dislike the Dragon's Rage Channeler and Death Shadow in Grixis. Let's go. Alrighty. So for those of you who's been following my content for a while now, when I was still on my own Patreon, before I joined Modern Solution with Sodek, I already made video like that a couple of months ago. I think it was like mid-October, something like that. Talking about those two cards and why I dislike them, because I've been asking, or I've been getting asked a lot about them, and I just wanted to put it in one convenient place with a sorta in-depth explanation of those topics for all people who wanted my answer in one place that's easy to access. So, from that video 2 months ago, give or take, a bunch of things has changed. So I will still be talking about those two cards. If you already watched that video a couple of months ago, you should watch this video as well, because some of my arguments, some of my thoughts has changed, and now this is my new updated take. So similarly to the last video I've made on this, first of all, I will talk a bit about how I perceive Grixis as a deck, how I view it as an archetype, because that's vital to understand why I dislike those cards. So, a phrase that I've used in my last video, which I really liked, was Jack of all trades, master of some, because even though the popular saying goes Jack of all trades, master of none, I do think that Grixis is an incredibly versatile deck with some really big strengths, areas in which it's exceptionally good. So I think that versatility is very important, and it's something that I strive to maintain in all my decks, basically, if I can. And that's the biggest strength of Grixis, in my opinion. It's very versatile, very multi-dimensional. You can present fast clock with Ragavan from time to time. You can also grind really well. I am comfortable grinding with any deck that's not named Greentron in Modern right now. With 4 color, it's, I think, 50-50. You will lose some longer games, you will win some longer games, and I do think that the matchup truly is very, very close with 4 color. It can go either way, and it often goes. But anything else, I do think that Grixis is, or my build of Grixis is advantaged in the long game. And I'm really comfortable with this position, because this gives me out to win early on with Ragavan. It gives me out to go later on with basically all that Lurus, Snapcaster Mage, Colagans command shenanigans. And you can also win sometimes in like somewhat in between. Sometimes you will just play discard spell. They won't have second answer for Lurus, and Lurus will run away with the game in like mid-game territory, which happens even though it's not very common, because people just play a bunch of removal in basically every single deck these days. And I do think that if you play DRC and to some extent Death Shadow, you are losing this versatility, because where it comes from, it comes from the deck construction. You see, my version of Grixis has few threats just for Ragavans. Let's say that Snapcasters are not threats, because, well, they are not. And technically Lurus is a threat, but it's in the sideboard, so It's obviously very important because this way you can play only for Ragavans and you have access to Lurus in every game to replay them if needed, and even to pressure your opponent with Lurus, which is great. It also has few counter spells, only for drums in the main deck. You have more in the sideboard, but I don't think this is that important because obviously you present your main deck in every single matchup. So this versatility is obviously important to some extent in the sideboard, but mostly focusing on the main deck here. And those removal spells can double as, or those counter spells can double as removal spells as well, which is quite important in a bunch of matchups in which counter spells are not great, like anything with Ether Vial. Or if you are on the draw against Hammer, you don't want a card that just counters. You do want to play to the board and answer their threats. And then you have obviously a pile of removal spells because Modern is very creature-centric these days. But other than that, you have a fair amount of card selection, let's say, and those replacement stuff like Snapcaster Mage. So basically, Snapcaster Mage is so great, obviously, because it can replace any spell. So it does make sideboard counter spells even better. It makes main deck removal and discard spells even better. But it can also double as another cantrip or card selection tool. So you do end up having 4 bubbles, 4 iterations for Snapcasters, 4 to 3 considers. I'm currently playing 3, but this can change in the future. I've been really pleased with 4, but I wanted to add second Cling to Dust to the deck. That's why I cut 1 consider, because I didn't feel like cutting anything else was possible. But that's not what the video is about. The difference between consider and Cling to Dust. So yeah. And I do think that if you add more creatures to this deck, you are disrupting this balance that I think is pretty well crafted at this point. I would like to play maybe 1 or 2 more 1-drops, but there is nothing on par with Ragavan that doesn't require this huge deck building commitments that I'm not ready for. So, also, one last thing before we go to specifically DRC and then the Shadow later on. I've talked in the last video about, or in the first version of this video back on my channel, about how I dislike the mid-range control, this kind of like definition, like not really, well, there are definitions for mid-range and control, obviously, but this kind of just names you are using for different archetypes, because I think that the most great decks is very fluent in how they approach the game, and just classifying them as mid-range or control is pretty limiting to your perception of the deck. It's obviously quite useful for especially newer players, so who lack context with like history of Magic and stuff like that, to help them understand what the deck is about. And you still can use those terms and you won't be very wrong, and I won't be mad at you or anything. I just don't like using them myself. But I guess to make you more capable to understanding why or how I perceive Grixis in terms of like other decks that have been popular in the past, I do think that the closest analogy to Grixis are fairies. I haven't played fairies in standard, sadly. I wasn't playing competitive Magic back then, but I did used to play a bunch of fairies in Modern a couple of years ago when Grixis, Death Shadow, and Eldrazi Tron were very popular, and I've loved every second of it. And I do think that Grixis is a pretty similar deck to fairies in many regards. You have the same Bitter Blossom kind of draws. You have Ragavan instead of Bitter Blossom now. And in those games when you don't have your very powerful proactive card, you are forced to play more interactive, more controlling game. So I am really, really glad that I can now play this similar style of deck in a 2021 power level version of it, basically. Okay, moving forward to DRC. The first of two creatures that I want to talk about. And first, let's go over some pros, because obviously it's not a terrible card by any means. I just don't think it's right for the deck. Well, this is what the video is about. I will tell you why. But once again, let's start with good things about DRC. So first of all, you are getting more proactive. And now you can kind of mulligan to your 1-drops, because you have 8 1-drops instead of 4 1-drops, like with Ragavans. And can't really mulligan to a 1-drop consistently if you only have 4 of them. You can mulligan for a 1-drop if you are playing a very specific matchup. For example, if you're playing against Tron, you can go to 4, 3, 2 cards basically to find Ragavan. And then, or no, maybe, I guess not and then, but you can't do so in the dark. You can't just sit in front of your opponent and go like, okay, my 7-card hand does not have Ragavan, hence I will mulligan. And you can do it to some degree with 8 1-drops. I don't think it's that common to do in Grixis. I think it was more of a Merctide issue, where you really needed a creature to press your advantage. I think Grixis, like DRC, Death Shadow builds, both of them. I guess they can be the same build, but there are basically 3 builds of Grixis right now, for those of you who don't know, or for those of you who are watching this video in a few months, when it's not obvious what was popular back then. It's Grixis Death Shadow, Grixis without shadows but with DRC, and then my version. Well, I guess it's not that popular, but I am playing it, so it's popular for me. And the key difference is the amount of 1-drops you are playing. Well, Shadow is technically a 1-drop, even though you don't play it on turn 1. So in Death Shadow we are playing 12. All of those Shadows, Darcys, and Ragavans. In Grixis without Shadow, that's Grixis midrange, let's say, you are playing Darcy and Ragavan, and in my version you are playing just Ragavan. Because of that, as I've already said, you can get more proactive, and if you think that you need to clog your opponent in any given matchup, you can do so more effectively than my version of Grixis. The second important pro of the RC is that it filters quite well. It gets the triggered ability that allows you to surveil every time you play a non-creature spell, which is great. It can help you find important cards in the matchup, and definitely can't be understated. But okay, so let's move to cons. And I think the biggest con in both Darcy and Death Shadow is that it requires some major deck building changes in the deck. Both of them, even though it's not that apparent for Darcy, I still think it requires some deck building and play pattern and like deck identity changes, because you do need to play a bunch of cheap stuff for Darcy to be really good, because you need her to trigger quite often. You need to get Delirium early on, unlike Unholy Hit. Like, obviously you want Delirium for Unholy Hit as soon as possible, but it's not that big of a deal if you don't have it on turn 2 or turn 3. and it might be for Darcy. So you have to play less of that Drown in the Log, Colagans command, Snapcaster Mage top end that I really like, because it clashes with what Darcy is all about. You are more about playing discard spells. You are more about playing stuff like Spell Pierce, maybe more bolts, but cheap stuff in general, which is somewhat limiting. And I guess also another pro of being more proactive that I've talked about in the first version of this video that I wanted to touch upon, because it's not important to the game of Magic itself, but it's important when you are grinding on Modo. If you are playing Darcy in your deck, you will finish your games faster on average. So if you just want to play as many matches as you can in 4 hours because you want to grind tickets, I guess this is also an upside for Darcy that I don't really want to take into consideration, because I don't think that those grinding issues are important in general. But if that's your gem, that's also something that's worth looking at. Okay, back to cons. I do think that Darcy also exacerbates your weakness to graveyard hate, because it's not great in the face of Rest in Peace, right? It's not great in the face of basically any graveyard hate, and it also exacerbates those draws in which not much comes together for you. So if you don't have Delirium for Unholy Heat, you also don't have Delirium for Darcy, and you can't kill their bigger blockers. You can't fly over them because you don't have Delirium. And that's just not great. I'm not the biggest fan of that. And it, once again, gives into this more... It's not really like linear deck, obviously, but it's more linear than the build without Darcy's, which is what I like. And finally, I think that's a fairly understated or underestimated, I guess. Well, I guess both understated and underestimated point of or weakness of Darcy. Or it's more of a strength of Ragavan, really, but still. I do think that it's important to note that Darcy does not require an immediate answer the same way Ragavan does. Why is that so important? Obviously, for Ragavan has higher snowball potential, which is very, very good, very crucial. But also, Ragavan can kinda steal, let's say, being on the play from your opponent, because if your opponent goes turn 1, I don't know, if they're playing a deck with that leans mostly on Prismatic Ending as their turn 1 removal spell. If they go land go, you go Ragavan go, they kind of have to take their turn 2 for dealing with Ragavan, because if they don't, then you'll be the first person to 3 mana. And even if they do, you are still the first person to really use your 2 mana most of the time, because you can cast your 2-drop, like Drown in the Log. And if they have 2 1-drops, like a creature and Prismatic Ending, that's great for them. But it's very demanding in terms of having an answer for it. I guess it's not what that means, but still, you get that. You really need an answer for Ragavan, and Ragavan can buy you this tempo advantage even when it gets traded seemingly even on mana. You still are using your turn 2, often with the second mana going to waste, which is quite important. So to sum up this Darcy part of this video, there are definitely pros, namely getting more proactive and winning the games faster. But the cons, in my opinion, outweighs the pros, getting more linear with your deck construction, getting a bit weaker to Grave Hate. Even though, I guess, if you are not playing Darcy, you are probably playing Snapcaster, which is also not great against Graveyard Hate. But still, you are getting another creature, so you're weaker against removal spells, which is not great in my opinion. I don't like being in that spot. And now we can move to Death Shadow. So I'm considerably higher on Death Shadow than I was in the first version of this video. Death Shadow being a card, Death Shadow, not an archetype. So the biggest pro of Death Shadow is obviously that it's really big for 1 mana. And it can finish the game very fast. It can block very well if you need to neuter like opposing Tarmogoyfs and stuff like this. Well, I guess it won't be larger than Tarmogoyf most of the time, but still stuff like Urza's Saga Constructs or Omnath or something like this. It also synergizes quite well with Dress Down, obviously, which in my first version of this video, I kind of treat it as a con to some extent because you kind of need to play Dress Down in the main deck. But with the format being changed in the way that it is now, I do think that Dress Down is an acceptable main deck card. So it's a bit of a pro right now instead of being a bit of a con, in my opinion. And then finally, it's unaffected by Graveyard Hate, which I think is a pretty big deal. Getting 8 threats that are good in the face of Graveyard Hate in Ragavan and Death Shadow. And I guess to some extent, people are playing Turak and Kroxa. Well, Kroxa is not great against Graveyard Hate, but Turak is. So you are getting better. You are better against Rest in Peace than you would have been otherwise, which is cool. And moving to cons that, unsurprisingly, once again, outweighs the pros. First of all, similarly as with DRC, the biggest con, in my opinion, is that you are making deck building and play pattern sacrifices to include Death Shadow in your deck. And in the past, it was definitely worth it because Death Shadow was head and shoulders the best, most efficient beater in the game. And that's just not the case. Right now, Ragavan is a better card than Death Shadow. So I dislike making those sacrifices and jumping through hoops to include Death Shadow in my deck if I can just play a better and, more importantly, less conditional one-drop in the Ragavan. Of course, you can say, Jędrek, but you can play both of them. Why wouldn't you do that? And to this I say, well, yes, that's true. But we are going back to the linearity issue that I've already mentioned a bunch of times. You don't want to be worse in the face of spot removal, in my opinion. I don't want to be worse in the face of spot removal, I guess. Speaking of spot removal, this is obviously the second weakness of Death Shadow. It's vulnerable to removal spells. I guess especially to Solitude, even though I think the whole Solitude versus Death Shadow matchup is getting kinda overrated. Like, it's obviously a great card, but as long as you're not playing 2 Death Shadow at the same time against a Solitude deck, you are not getting very far behind on the trait of Solitude versus Death Shadow. Of course, sometimes you have to press your opponent. For example, last night I've been watching my opponent, my friends playing. It was Canister on 4-color and our friend Homik on Death Shadow. And Canister just had a bunch of weaknesses in hands and like Wandering Mind. So Homik fought season turn 1, saw that there was no Solitude, and he was kind of forced to play both Death Shadow just to finish the game before the grinding potential of Canister's hand was able to overtake. Obviously, Canister, lucky as he is, top decked a Solitude, and both Death Shadows went to, well, one went to graveyard, one to exile, but you get what I'm saying. I don't think that this like weakness to Solitude is that important. It's important as it is weakness to removal in general. I don't think that weakness to Solitude is that much more important than weakness to Prismatic Ending. And I do think that still the biggest downside of playing Death Shadow is that you can't play stuff like Blackcliff Cliffs or other fastlands, which are really good, especially if you want to go longer. And you have to play for Thoughtseize, which is less of an issue than it was in October, I think, because Thoughtseize is a bit better now, I think. So overall, I used to firmly believe 2 months ago that DRC is a better card in Grixis than Death Shadow, and now I'm not sure, because Death Shadow's stock has risen in my eyes, mostly because both Dress Down and Thoughtseize, which are two main sacrifices you need to make in your deck construction, aside from playing no fastlands and all fetchlands, shocklands, which is also quite big in my opinion. But yeah, both Dress Down and Thoughtseize got better as a main deck additions, and I guess sideboard additions as well, but in this deck you're playing main deck copies of both of those cards. So this sacrifice is lower than before. I could see playing a deck with Death Shadows and no Darcies, but it's really hard to build. And I've tried several times and I failed several times. Maybe you have to cut some Snapcasters and put them in the sideboard, because I am certain that I want 4 Snapcasters in my deck postboard, even if I'm playing Death Shadow, because Snapcaster is just making your sideboard card so much better. And I think there might be a way to build that, but I didn't manage to succeed. And for now, I won't focus on that because I don't think that's necessary. So yeah, that's it. That's my quick-ish roundup on why I dislike Darcy and Death Shadow. If you are watching this video and it's the first time you encountered our content here at Modern Solutions, thank you so much for choosing to click on our links. And you can find more videos on the channel and also some other places in which we're making content in the description below. There is a bunch of links down there. Link to our Patreon, which is our main source of content. And if you want to help both us and you by getting better in Magic, you can sign up for the Patreon. It will be much appreciated. And that's it. Thanks for watching this video. I'm gonna be back either tomorrow for you or later on today. I don't really discuss with Sodek how we're gonna schedule those videos, but we have 2 videos going up this week. This one that I'm recording myself and the other one that we've recorded together. So regardless of that, I wish you all the best for the showcase this weekend. Have a lovely weekend, and I'm gonna see you when I see you. Bye bye. Take care.